The content discussed in this episode is for educational or informative purposes only and should not be replaced by individualized professional consultations or professional medical advice.
Welcome to the Founder Series of Doctor of the Podcast. This year I'm signing up for a triathlon happening in summer, and to prepare myself, in this Founder Series I'm going to be having one-on-one conversations with experts in the field, and hopefully it will keep myself accountable and nurture my community on a day-to-day. So without further ado, hope you enjoy this episode. So hi everyone. So today is our Founder Series, and today we have Andy Chan. Andy Chan is a certified strength and conditioning specialist educator, and drawing on his master's degrees in exercise science and influenced by his 10-year stay in the United States, he has a unique outlook on health and athletic performance. He recently released his book, Dynamic Balance, where they look at the interconnectedness of diet, emotions, and training through the lens of traditional Chinese medicine. So glad to have you on the show, Andy. Welcome to Doctor of the Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
So, Andy, I am on a journey of getting ready for a triathlon. And the idea of the Founder Series is to speak to different coaches, sports scientists, athletes, to get that guidance, that advice, so that, I'm not too lost in this journey. And so what I'd like to speak about today is the balance between exercise and rest. And I'd like to pick your brains on, what physiologically speaking happens when you're actually exercising and training, but how rest comes into the actual overall holistic process of getting ready for a triathlon.
When we look at the topic of recovery, it has certainly been increasingly popular over the past few years because we realize that we just cannot go hard forever. And even though society tells us to keep training hard, keep the grind, keep working hard, keep training hard, I think we do realize that at some point our bodies break down. And, in recent years, I actually have been going back to ancient wisdom in explaining the need for recovery. This is usually where I would explain what the yin yang philosophy signifies. And to be honest with you, sometimes if I am speaking to a more Western audience, there is a preconception to what the yin yang philosophy is. And they would probably say, oh, why are you bringing up the yin yang philosophy to talk about recovery? And this is where I tell them, well, if you think about the yin yang philosophy, if we apply it to movement, we'll know that if we're going hard, as strenuous, we're going aggressive, running as fast as we can today, then we'll know that's yang, because that signifies something that's energetic and fast and bright.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, if you think about the yin and sign, it is complementary and yet it is contradictory, right? So if you look at the symbol, it has equal amounts of white and equal amounts of black. And if we think about our daily lives, our current lifestyle, I would say a lot of us we put an emphasis on the aggressive side and on the energetic side, and we're just not putting enough emphasis on the recovery. And so through that simple philosophy, we will know that, humans figured this out thousands of years ago, that we need to have good balance when it comes to longevity, when it comes to human performance. And on the actual recovery part, well, we know in modern exercise science, we always say that your progress always hinges upon your body's ability to tolerate, to recover from, and to adapt to a stress. Right? So let's say today, Guni, you train for triathlon. You're doing all these training, you're putting all the stress on the body. If your body cannot tolerate and cannot recover from and cannot adapt to this stress, then, hey, you're not going to become a better athlete. So it is because of these two perspectives that we say recovery is critical to athletic performance and overall health.
I am no athlete here, but...
No. Everyone is an athlete. Everyone is an athlete.
In their head, but physically speaking, I am not there. But when you want to get to a certain target and you have goals, some people might think that rest might kind of prevent them from getting there. It's like, oh, I'm wasting my time resting instead of being out there training and getting myself building up muscles or building up endurance. Because you did touch upon yin and yang, so it's a balance. But would you say that the equal amount of stress that you put on yourself as you train needs to be counteracted at the same amount of level for resting?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So the question essentially, if you look at it from another perspective, is how do we define the quality of our recovery? or how do we define what to do in our recovery?
That's
Because
right.
let's say if I train for triathlon 3 hours a day, 1 hour running, 1 hour on the bike, 1 hour swimming, do I just like do nothing for 3 hours? And so and I think this is where people need to be educated, because there are a lot of ways to actively recover. And certainly we know now in the exercise science world, people are applying a lot of not only pharmaceuticals, but actually natural techniques that were used. Again, if we tie back to Chinese medicine, if you look at the fitness industry now, people are applying cupping, they're applying acupuncture, and they're applying maybe some gua sha or some scraping. If you look at exercise science, they will look at our soft tissues or our fascia, or basically the connective tissues that surrounds the muscle. What we know is that through strenuous training, let's say if our muscles are overworked, then the analogy that we will give, or the picture that we usually give, is let's imagine you're holding a sponge in your hand. And if you kind of if we draw parallels there, if you think of that as your soft tissue, ideally we want the sponge to be pliable and we want it to be soft, and that way we can manipulate it. Because if you think
Right.
about athletic performance, the best athletes are the ones who are agile and they can move in all different directions, and they're powerful and elegant in their movement. Those people who think they're not athletes, no, number one, they're not coordinated. And number two, the reason why they're not coordinated is because when they try to move, or when they try to dance, when they try to run, their movements are just a bit rigid.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that if you think about the sponge, a sponge that is pliable can contribute to smooth movement. Yet on the other hand, a sponge that is hard, brittle, and just a bit rough, it has trouble producing those elegant and smooth movements. So therefore, we know that if we are training for a long time and if we have overused a muscle, then we have to apply modalities that returns to that pliable state. And one, if we look at the physical modalities, we can obviously apply those three that I talked about. So the acupuncture, the gua sha, the scraping. But this is where the mental side comes in, because, actually the state of our soft tissue is directly related to our emotions, because my emotional state elicits or evokes responses from my body. So the current state of my mind actually determines or has a big impact on how my soft tissues react.
Essentially, these practices in traditional Chinese medicine, let's pick one practice, acupuncture. What does it effectively do?
To understand acupuncture, they will say that it is through injecting needles that you stimulate different acupuncture or acupressure points, and through that you can stimulate a reaction from the body, and therefore improving circulation, which in the Chinese medicine language it is called blood and qi. So that's their way of explaining the smoothness of energy. We are improving circulation by injecting needles into certain acupuncture points, into along the lines of meridians. And we know now from the Western perspective that by stimulating the skin, we are inducing changes that originates from the brain.
Doing a session in acupuncture, what's happening is like there's like also redirection of your energy, because as you're stressing your body in a certain way, there are maybe certain muscles that are solicited more than the others, and so rearrangement of energy, it's that balancing of that, the yin and the yang that you were talking about in the beginning.
Yeah, and well, I just want to piggyback on that, and Chinese medicine has always been predicated on the fact, or based on the premise, that the body is an interconnected unit. It's an ecosystem. Look, Western medicine has changed lives for sure. We all know that. Yet in traditional anatomy sessions, we have learned in school that muscles work in isolation. So my biceps, it flexes my elbows. My shoulder, my deltoids, it flexes my shoulders. And we now know that the body is so much more than just these isolated body parts. And people have been saying this for thousands of years. So I agree with you. This redirecting energy is profound.
And what would be your advice to anyone that's out there in terms of any ethnic minority and who is trying to get out there, be more fit, exercise, living this kind of holistic lifestyle where we understand that there's, as you beautifully put it in your book, which is an interconnectedness of diet, emotions, and training, where it's basically what you what you eat, how you feel, and how you move. For someone who's trying to put themselves out there and trying to be in this holistic kind of way of approaching life, what would be your advice to them?
First off is to embrace cultural food. In the health and science or in the health and fitness worlds, there seems to be a perfect diet, which is steamed chicken, steamed chicken, steamed chicken, steamed broccoli, steamed fish, and brown rice, no dressing, yada yada. Get your vitamins in,
Oh my God, that's so
and
true.
yet there's this stereotypical diet. We say stereotypical, yet there's some truth to it. The historic diets, we all eat different foods depending on where we are, and so therefore the first advice I'll give is eat what is culturally acceptable where you are at. And chances are, if Mother Nature has given that to your culture, it is good for your body. And just don't assume that someone in Hong Kong should eat the same diet as someone in Scandinavia, right? So I was in Scandinavia from a honeymoon 2 years ago in December, and I was there to see the Northern Lights. And just to give you some context, in Hong Kong, we eat a lot of vegetables and we eat a lot of fresh food, especially fresh seafood. And when I went to Scandinavia, it was so cold. It was minus 20 something degrees there, and there were no vegetables, and we were eating all these meat that I've never had before, and that was fine. You know, you've got to embrace it. Or it would be insensitive of me if I go there and say, why don't we have more vegetables? Because we need to retain heat. And we need to retain energy. We need to warm the body up. So usually the first advice I'll give is for diet, just stick to what's culturally acceptable and eat what's around you. In the very same way, when we are as a minority, don't feel like you have to conform to whatever is happening around you. Just embrace who you are and know that ultimately, if you make the best, healthiest decision for your body, other people will respect you. And what I find is certainly now I bear the fruits of my transparency and my vulnerability, and other people respect me for it. But I would say at first it was quite hard being that person. So if you're listening, just take heart in being yourself, essentially is what I'm saying.
Yeah, live authentically, isn't it? Be yourself, be vulnerable. What about movement and training? What would be your message to them?
Well, if we tie it back to the beginning of the podcast where we used an analogy of a sponge, we talked about how the sponge should be pliable, it should be soft, so it can be manipulated in different ways. And if we look at the connection between our soft tissue, which is the sponge, and our mental state, we have to first understand two responses: the fight or flight response and the rest and digest response. So in the fight or flight, as the name suggests, thousands of years ago, we might be chilling under a tree, and all of a sudden there might be a predator. So there might be a lion or a bear right in front of us. So at that moment, you have two choices: you either fight it or you run from it. And as a result, in this state, your mind, perhaps the body, it evokes a response, an inflammatory response, in fact, that tightens up the body so that you can produce force immediately. Because we know that if your muscles or if your soft tissues, if the sponge is very loose, it's quite hard to generate a lot of force. On the other hand, if it is tight and if it is ready to go, then you'll be ready to fight or flight. So we know that in the fight or flight, in that inflammatory response, our body becomes rigid or it becomes tight. And then in the rest and digest state, it is the opposite, because we know that the mind is trying to recover. So as a result, our heart rate goes down and our soft tissues become more pliable. So this is where it connects, because my mental state directly affects the status of my soft tissue. And this actually works in reverse. Like a lot of people just focus on this one way direction, but this connection is actually bilateral. Meaning, let's say if I'm just sitting for a long time, the office position. So a lot of weekend warriors, they work at in front of a desk for 8 hours a day, and then they go train at night. But what happens during those 8 hours is that you trick your mind into fight or flight by being rigid. Because let's say if I am sitting with a hunchback posture for even just for an hour, effectively I am trying to make myself rigid. So by becoming rigid, my mind also thinks that I am in fight or flight.
That's a good
Point, right? And then so over the long run, I'm just in fight or flight. And then we go to the gym, we do triathlon training, which is also, fight or flight. And I think this is where the spiral happens, because we then never give our body the chance to recover.
What I really take out of this is the concept of agility and being able to balance rest and active recovery, it actually helps you to be more agile when you need to train, and when you're not supposed to train, how to actually actively recover so that you can be more agile on performance level, and has its importance, and we shouldn't be neglecting it.
Oh, for sure. And, to take it one step further, so the next question we should ask is, so how should I train, right? So now we've talked about the connection between emotions and training. Well, here is where I draw from ancient wisdom, because as we all know, in Chinese medicine, in yoga, in all these ancient practices, people have been practicing Qigong, they've been doing dances, and they've been doing different type of aerobics for thousands of years. And we've been searching for elegant movements for a long time. Even when people go on a run, the best athletes who are running effortlessly.
Right.
Those who are running with effort, if they're just muscling it out, they can never go far, because we know that they're inefficient. We already know they're inefficient by looking at how they're running.
Right.
And therefore, at the gym, a lot of us have been stuck in isolated muscle training. So again, we tie back to the beginning of the podcast. We talked about in conventional or traditional anatomy, people look at the isolated muscle function.
Yeah.
So let's say today, if I want to become a better runner, some people, they might work on their core in isolation. So they will do some sit-ups because they think, oh, if I have a stronger core, it's going to reduce my injury risk. But if you look at the core in a functional sense, if you're a runner, the core is to help me transfer energy. So it is the link between my lower body and upper body. And if you think about ground reaction force, which means when I take a step on the ground, I'm interacting with the ground, and the core is to stabilize my body against outside forces. So a better way to train it is, number one, I need to work on better coordination, as you alluded to it. That's the key of my training philosophy, because after all, the best athletes are the ones who can coordinate. And number two, we have to think about the core in that sense, which is to help us protect the spine, not to produce power, because you don't do a setup in the triathlon that you're going to participate in. So when it comes to training, we have to understand isolated muscle training might not be the best way forward, but rather we're talking about total body movements. So like a lunge plus a press, or maybe squat plus press, basically more complex movements that we do.
Right. I mean, it's a great takeaway, a great point you're making. And this morning I went swimming, and I did look at some of the swimmers and it's like, how can I improve? And you do see swimmers that are actually struggling, in the sense that it looks like it's an effort to go through, do that lap. Then you have very elegant, and I like the word that you're saying, like elegant swimmers, where you feel that they're actually dancing and it's effortless. They're doing that lap so gracefully, and you could tell that there's something different in the way they're using their body to, while they're effectively doing the same thing. So I'll be thinking, how do I like make this more graceful as I train?
Yeah. Just remember to smile as you and this just reinforces the point that we have been intuitively searching for elegant movement, because the chances are, once you see someone who's kind of going in their flow, you're going to be like, wow, she's an athlete. But for some reason, we just never think that we have the capability to move like her, right? We just kind of think, oh, so this would happen. I tell you, like my typical client, they'll come in, oh, I'm a swimmer, but I'm slow. So I which muscles do I have to work at? And I tell them, well, perhaps it's not a muscular thing. It's maybe it's a coordination thing, because you're trying too hard, and perhaps it's a mobility thing, because from that bad posture, you're trying to force yourself into opening up your shoulders, yet you find yourself being a bit stuck. And in that instance, perhaps training for muscular endurance is not, or muscular strength is not appropriate, because what you lack is range of motion. So this ties back to recovery, because again, if you're rigid, sometimes it's best to look at ways to recover and calm the nervous system down.
Love it. A full cycle. Yeah. And what I'd like to kind of shift towards into our conversation is to get to know more about your experience as an ethnic minority in sport. And with your experience in the US, and now you're currently based in Hong Kong, but what was your experience in the sport world as an ethnic minority?
So a little bit of my personal background, I spent 10 years in the United States for school. And I was a big football player, a big as in I was very into football, soccer in the US as they call it. And in 12th grade, I was chosen as the captain of my high school soccer team, which was something that I was immensely proud of. And the day that I was elected captain, I was voted captain by my teammates. The coach, he came to me and he said, Andy, you should be very proud of yourself because there are not many Asians who could be a captain in a major sports team in Connecticut, which was the state that I was in. And at the time, I was like, oh, yeah, it's a pretty big achievement. But over time, if I think about it, that was quite a disrespectful statement because I don't know, maybe he did mean, maybe he was well intended. But now that I think back, he kind of boxed me in a little bit.
Boxed you in, labeled you, the racist comment or the bias that comes with it is pretty heavy. And for a kid at that point to deal with this, do you see how like automatically you try to brush it off? Because that's just, coping mechanism, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think the coping mechanism is just to pretend like there's nothing happening, right? Because certainly in my high school, there weren't that many Asian kids, and the school was predominantly Caucasian. And I would sometimes hang out with some African Americans. There were two, three very good friends of mine, and then we'll talk about the racism issues that happens within the school itself. And obviously on the fields, it was all fair game because you always just let that, why don't you go home, chant with some expletives in the middle of the game whenever I do something horrible. And it was frustrating, but yet I was numb to it, to be honest, because if someone tells that to you every single game, then you just kind of treat it as, oh, it's just another thing they're going to say. But what I think it had an impact on me, though, is the fact that I now have developed a personality where I feel like I have to prove myself to the world all the time. And we're going to talk about the Yin Yang philosophy here because it's a good and bad, right? There are always two sides to a story. Me wanting to
Definitely.
prove myself, it's good because I'm driven, right, on the outside. Whoa, Andy's always driven. He's published a book. He's delivering all these conferences. He's out there impacting others. But we know on the negative side, we know this stems from an insecurity that I have inside me, which originated from me being the underdog all the time.
Yeah, which is sad to hear that for example, that coach, instead of celebrating your skills, athlete that you were, he pointed out what you looked like was what was emphasized. That's where the distance is drawn. It's because like you're different from us, and it did impact you. Because I think you were saying numbing, but as ethnic minorities, you have these moments quite a bit, especially when you live in the West, and you have these microaggressions actually, and you just try to make it seem like it's not affecting you, but like again, in a more kind of holistic, energetical philosophy, this does affect you. And as you said, it affects you in a way where the way you conduct yourself in your life.
Like there's almost this anger within me. It's like, oh, I've got to prove to all these Americans that I'm worthy. But that's so unnecessary. So I think for me now it is knowing this kind of tendency of mine, and now for me it is a case of kind of toning it down because at the end of the day, I don't have to prove to no one about my self-worth and what I can do. So I think that's what I'm currently working on.
And you know what? I'm really glad that you're opening up with regards to that particular side where we don't hear a lot of Asians that are sharing their experience of and the challenges with regards to that, because we usually stay in our own and maybe slightly talk about it within the community, but it's never put out there. So thanks for being vulnerable, and especially as a man, an Asian man, it's something that you don't see often. So thanks for kind of speaking up and being an example for your community.
I sometimes need to be a bit cautious when I talk about my high school coach so that people don't look him up, But I hope he reads it because then he'll understand that he wasn't a very good teacher back then. He might have improved now because we all can change over time. So
yeah, let's hope for the best. That's a positive outlook. And so as we're closing our conversation, we always like to ask our guest rapid fire questions. So you ready?
I am ready. Come at me.
Okay. So what is the first sign that you notice when you're out of balance?
First sign for me, my face is oily.
You are the first person who tells me this. Okay, so you see your face getting oily. What is the coping mechanism with that?
Yeah, the coping mechanism, usually I look whether I'm sleeping well or whether I'm eating too much meat because I I like eating meat, like a lot of fitness people do, because I have a good mixture of East versus West. So I still think protein is important from my studies, and as a result, sometimes I'll still have too much protein. And we know that when we have so much nutrition, sometimes if the body cannot handle it, it's going to be a bit damp in Chinese medicine terms, which means that there's just too much that the body cannot handle, and it'll be reflected in an oily phase and maybe acne breakout and stuff like that. So that's usually the two that I look at. Because it also might be false, as if I'm not getting enough sleep, it might also give me a false response. So that's why I have to look at both my sleeping quality and time, as well as what I'm eating.
I love it. So having kind of your face being that signal.
Well, I look at my face all the time, so no, sorry.
Yeah. No narcissistic
Yeah,
behavior.
exactly.
No, just
Exactly.
kidding.
I mean, we cannot escape the opportunity. Every single time you go to the bathroom, you look at your phone, and so to anyone who says that they're not looking at their face that much throughout the day, I just don't think so. I disagree. Next question. Sorry.
What is one book that impacted your approach to well-being and wellness?
The book is actually called Deep Work, and believe it or not, it is a business book. And the premise of the book, Deep Work by Cal Newport, is that it is through concentrated work that fulfills us. And we need to do enough deep work every single day to have a meaningful life, essentially, because a lot of us have shallow lives these days, which just involves us looking on social media, not really doing anything. And the specific tip that actually changed my perspective on wellness is tip number 2, embrace boredom. People don't understand how profound this is, because, if we sit there just doing nothing, we feel a bit restless, right? Oh, I need to find something to do. And so if you are able to embrace the fact that you are bored, you're actually embracing recovery. Because, we talk about how people think that we just sleep for recovery. Sleep is a great recovery modality. It's the best recovery tool. Yet people are not sleeping. They're laying on top of couch, watching Netflix, watching Discovery Plus. And therefore at that instant, yeah, exactly. They're all watching YouTube. So, if we just can embrace boredom, then I believe it will be very good for our mental wellness. And certainly that's what changed my mental wellness, and therefore have better results after that. So Deep Work by Cal Newport.
It's such a nice way to rephrase sit in stillness, because sitting in stillness is something that you can hear when, in kind of the holistic vocabulary jargon, but embrace boredom is a direct translation and is much more relatable. So thank you for that. Thank you.
And it is much more positive. I actually didn't make that connection until you said it, but yes, it is the same thing. It is the same, just be still, but it's a very positive way of going about being still.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Andy, for spending the time with me on this show and sharing your wisdom around how to integrate kind of ancient wisdom into your daily training and actually just your lifestyle in general. So it's really valuable having you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Guni. It was a great chat.
If you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and select that follow or subscribe button. For now, stay safe and we'll see you next week.